Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part video series which attempts to provide organizing principles for understanding the human and planetary condition. In part 1 we looked at the patterns which have occurred over the last 8,000 years, and we saw that there is a repeating pattern which occurs roughly every 275 years or so, and we're at or near the end of a cycle which started in 1776. In this video, part 2, we'll explore what key things are emerging as an inevitable consequence of the collapse of the old way of doing things. In other words, the good news amidst the doom and gloom. And then in the final video, we'll attempt to answer the question of, well, so what should we do in the face of all these happenings? So we'll look at the evolution biologist's explanation of how species evolve. Then we'll look at the evolution of competition and collaboration. And finally, we'll consider how the evolution of the human species can support an effort to rebalance society. So let's dive in with one of my favorite quotes. Our great challenge is to imagine how a new era of Earth's history can emerge. Our work in the world is not just a stopgap to extinction or a stopgap for pollution or fracking or whatever else it might be. We are part of the great work of laying the foundations of a new cultural and biological era. And it's because of this last sentence that we're spending so much of our time on history and the evolution of species in this video series, rather than responding directly to the individual crises. It's to understand the context first. So to start, let's look at the cycle of evolution. So evolution is this series of leaps in complexity. Evolution biologists tell us that we started out as hydrogen and carbon that combined with DNA, which then became fish, amphibians, dinosaurs, and eventually mammals and hominoids. So we start with very simple structures which come together and gradually increase in complexity. And Elizabeth Sartoris tells us that this process happens with human settlements as well. So we evolve from tribes to villages to cities and now nation states. Each is a huge leap in complexity. And she's got a very good 35-minute talk that gives a very good overview of this. And if I understand Elizabeth correctly, her key point is that these leaps in complexity can't occur without collaboration between different organisms. Collaboration is key. And so each leap in complexity involves giving up the previous comfortable, safe way of doing things. Whatever we did in the past is not going to work as we make this huge leap forward. And so that involves embracing the next scary, unknown way of doing things. And there's no guarantee that it works. Think of the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. Not every caterpillar makes it. And so this leap can result either in death or transformation. In part 1, we saw that we're nearing the end of a naturally occurring cycle of civilization. And when that happens, there's the potential for one of these leaps in complexity. But there's no guarantee that the leap will benefit everyone. So way back in 1974, psychologist Claire Graves found that there are 3 possible outcomes for the future of humanity considering this leap. And he published his findings in a paper entitled Human Nature Prepares for a Momentous Leap. So the first option is a massive regression. Imagine if we lost all power, all forms of governance, the entire economy collapsed all at the same time. That would pretty much take us back to hunter-gatherer societies. The second option is where there is tyrannical governments, huge amounts of surveillance on citizens, and significant loss of personal freedoms. That would be similar to George Orwell's 1984. But then there's a third option, which is this momentous leap that results in a fundamentally different form of society. And it's comparable to the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. The end result has no bearing on the starting result. They're completely different. What can we expect towards the end of the 275-year cycle? And the answer is where we focus our attention. So it depends on whether we want to focus on the dying caterpillar or the emerging butterfly. And this next slide might show this more clearly. So now we can explain the reason why we had to discuss the 275-year cycle in video 1. And why this emergence process we're discussing now. It's because it's how you view the next decade or so that matters. So mainstream media focuses only on the very narrow view of what has been before. That's the known. They focus on the doom and gloom, basically to keep us small and fearful so that we don't consider what is emerging. So as we go through the transition, which will take the next 10 years or so, there's a bit of interference. You can see the interference above the word transition there. As old ways of thinking die out and new ways of thinking emerge. This always happens between stage 6 and 7, so we should expect and anticipate this. But our challenge between now and 2030 is to find those who can see the emergent and help amplify what they see and what they communicate. That way we can collectively drive the emergence process forward, no matter what happens as a result or during the collapse. So now that we've seen that evolution is a series of leaps in complexity, let's look at competition versus collaboration, but within this context of evolution. So there are two very different worldviews, and how you and society views the world affects all social systems: education, the exchange mechanism or the economy, governance, religion, business, defense, and policing. So you can see that it's important to know which preference you have of these two worldviews. One worldview is all about aggression and competition and acquiring as much as one can for themselves. The other is about cooperation, collaboration, and helping others that are less fortunate. And as you can imagine, these different worldviews create very different types of societies. But where did the idea of these two worldviews come from? So Charles Darwin was an English naturalist and geologist and biologist. He was heavily influenced by the work of Malthus, an English cleric, scholar, and influential economist. He was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest. In 1859, he published On the Origin of Species. And then on the right, we have Pyotr Kropotkin, who was a Russian anarchist, socialist, revolutionary, economist, socialist, historian, zoologist, political scientist, human geographer, and to top it all, a philosopher. He was very familiar with the work of Darwin, but couldn't quite come to grips with it, and so he published in 1902 a book called Mutual Aid. And Darwin admitted in his book that when he saw cooperation among animal species, he didn't really have an answer for it. He said cooperation posed one special difficulty which at first appeared to me insuperable or insurmountable and actually fatal to my whole theory. So he didn't have an answer for this idea of species collaborating. So Kropotkin was intimately familiar with On the Origin of Life, but he was perplexed by this idea of competition as the only driver for evolution. So he set out to write Mutual Aid, and what he wanted to do was provide a different perspective to Darwin's ideas in Origin. And he said this right at the beginning of the book: even where animal life teemed in abundance, Darwin previously had said when there was so much animal life, then that invariably end up in competition. But Kropotkin failed to find evidence of the struggle for life as the dominant factor of evolution. And then the rest of his book is explaining the findings that he came up with. Here's my favorite quote about survival of the fittest, and it comes from Kropotkin in Mutual Aid. If we ask nature, who are the fittest? Those who are continually at war with each other, or those who support one another? The answer that we get is we see that those animals which acquire habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. They have more chances to survive, and they attain in their respective classes the highest development of intelligence and bodily organization. So a very strong statement coming out that the evolutionary drive is more around mutual aid or collaboration than competition. But now what about geopolitically? Is there any evidence of competition and collaboration playing out on the world stage? And the answer is absolutely yes. On the competitive side, you have NATO, intent on expanding territory and world domination. Provoking Russia through Ukraine and provoking China through Taiwan are but two of the latest examples. And then on the collaborative side, you have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and our own country, South Africa. Now, this collaboration might not be obvious from press reports, particularly around the war in Ukraine, where these news reports come from NATO countries. But remember that we are in a post-truth era, and perhaps there's a reason to put a spin on Putin's speeches. And if you read his speeches directly from the Kremlin website, not interpreted through Western media, you will see frequent mentions of collaboration, cooperation, sovereignty, a multipolar world, and the like. A particularly excellent address is his 16th of August address in 2022 to participants and guests of the 10th Moscow Conference on International Security. And if you watch independent media, not mainstream media, through this lens of competition versus collaboration, you'll see the characteristics of each quite clearly and which country follows more of a collaborative route than a competitive route. So hostilities in Ukraine and Taiwan represent an ideological battle between these two different worldviews, one of competition and one of collaboration. There is no doubt that we are in a world war over how we view the world. The competitive worldview is inconsistent with evolution, which strives towards collaboration and leaps in complexity, as we saw earlier. So if we adapt Kropotkin's earlier quote about survival of the fittest, we get the following quote: "Which nations are the fittest? Those who are continually at war with each other, or those who support one another? Those nations which acquire habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. They have more chances to survive, and they attain the highest development of intelligence and social organization." And we can maybe add the word resilience into that quote. In other words, they're able to survive significant climate changes. So with apologies to Peter Kropotkin. And now for a quote from a real person: "The world needs a platform like BRICS to offer leadership that does not rely on threats, sanctions, and war." So let's go back to the two worldviews again and ask whether both Darwin and Kropotkin could have been correct, even though their two books appear to contradict each other. I mean, look at both beards. There are more similarities between these two gentlemen than differences. So there are two theories which support the idea that both worldviews could be correct. Let's have a look at them. So the first is Elizabeth Sartoris, who explained that maturity equals collaboration, and that during your youthful years, there's high levels of competition. And as one matures, as the species matures, you see higher levels of cooperation and collaboration. The second theory is Donella Meadows in her 2008 book, Thinking in Systems, where she essentially says that it's the system that determines behavior. The system, to a large extent, causes its own behavior. An outside event may unleash that behavior, but the same outside event applied to a different system is likely to produce a different result. Let's try and say that a little bit more simply. If you consider society as the system itself, an altruistic person will tend to compete when placed in a competitive system, structure, or society. So now when we merge these two models, one from Meadows and the other from Sartoris, we could say that a more mature society collaborates and a less mature society competes. And then individuals within each of those societies take on the behaviors of that society. So a quick check-in. We saw that evolution is a series of leaps in complexity. And we looked at two different worldviews of competition versus collaboration. And we also saw that it is more mature to collaborate. And we conclude from that that the evolutionary drive in humanity is towards collaboration. So let's take a look at a few recommended books in case you'd like to explore this topic further, the topic of collaboration. And then we'll have a look at a rebalanced society. So the first is a relatively recent book called The Social Instinct by Nicola Raihani, who is from the UK. And she says cooperation is not only commonplace in nature, but is of profound evolutionary and social significance. So pretty much confirming what we've just spoken about. And that cooperation is responsible for most of the major evolutionary transitions. In other words, if we are expecting humanity to make a momentous leap, it cannot happen without cooperation. Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard describes forests as social and cooperative creatures. You've heard of the wood wide web, which is how trees communicate with each other through underground networks. And she says that the communal lives of trees, the way they engage with each other, is not that different from our own. Jeremy Lent's Patterning Instinct from 2017 explores differences in the underlying stories that cultures have used to construct meaning in their world. And where the story is one around competition, it results in a very different society where the story is more around collaboration. So next we're going to look at how does the more mature collaborative approach result in a rebalanced society. And firstly, this idea is introduced by Henry Mintzberg, who wrote a book called Rebalancing Society, and he talks pretty much he compares society to a spin cycle of a washing machine. If the load inside is unbalanced, then eventually it goes out of control and has to be stopped, and the load must be rebalanced before the spin cycle can continue. And he says that societies now are in that same phase, and we need to rebalance. We're spinning faster and faster and faster, and we need to slow things down and rebalance. So he looks at the three influential sectors of society: the private sector, which is business; public sector, which is government; and then the people sector, which is what used to be called civil society. I don't like that phrase, because what is uncivil society? And so the question we're pondering is, how does each sector officialize their value to society? And then can that value be rebalanced? So how do they do it in the private sector? Well, in the private sector, you have certification. In order to operate as a lawyer, doctor, plumber, director of a company, etc., you have to have a piece of paper on the wall with a tick on it that says that you're certified to operate as that particular role. In the public sector, you've got something called licensing. So you can't drive a vehicle, you can't go fishing, you can't open a company or register a business without a piece of paper, again, with a tick on it that says you're now licensed to operate as that entity. But in the people sector, we have a huge amount of value contributed to society: care for the aged, raising children, all of that bottom part of the iceberg that right now has no formal either certification or licensing process. And this list is extensive of what civil society contributes towards society. An evolutionary, more mature society has robust communities, respected governments, and responsible businesses. And if you ask those questions of your community, is your community robust? Is your government respected? Are the businesses in your city responsible? You'll see that we have quite some way to go to rebalance our society. So how do we do that? Well, we believe that creating healthy, equitable value flows between people, public and private sectors, while nurturing nature, is the way to do it. So another quick check-in before we move on. We learned that we are 246 years into a cycle that lasts on average 275 years. In other words, we're in late-stage civilizational collapse. We saw that evolution is a series of leaps in complexity accompanied by higher levels of collaboration, and that without collaboration, that leap cannot occur. So given all this information, what on earth should we do to rebalance our societies? Well, that's what we'll cover in the next and final video of this series, because we're all about solutions, not only about focusing on predicaments. So I hope to see you there, and thanks for watching. So what do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Please do drop a note in the comments or send us an email with your thoughts. What we're hoping to achieve with this series of videos is to catalyze discussion around the complex, interrelated topics of energy, war, disease, climate, and human progress. If you know someone who might be interested in these overlapping topics, please share this series with them. Thanks again for watching.